and I'm here to talk about something that I found just recently. And this is a commemorative mug dedicated to quality for the Chrysler Technology Center, October 1991 Advantage Chrysler. And that brings up the story of how the CTC was created. So let's talk about that for a bit. Nobody expected Chrysler to be able to build this kind of an edifice, this kind of a setup with testing laboratories, and at a late time in its development, sort of enforcement of the cross-functional team approach that they were adopting then, which they called platform teams because it was a bunch of people from different functions would get together to develop a new platform, or in reality, a new car on a new platform. So they had one of these for the Vipers. Many say that that was the test of the idea. And keep in mind that this was the same idea that AMC had used for many, many years because they didn't have enough people to have specializations, to the point that Chrysler did. They didn't have a big enough product line. They weren't doing enough product development. They couldn't keep it going. Honda, though, also did cross-functional teams. You could really argue that even before the first Skunk Works, incidentally, the original Chrysler team, the Three Musketeers of Zader, Brer, and Skelton, not in that order, actually worked on a cross-functional team basis, and that they actually really did do what Chrysler would later call a platform team to create the first Chrysler. So the Chrysler Technology Center was pitched by executives, engineers, and architects, and they all worked together on it in what John Roberts, who was with the project from start to finish, actually called a platform team approach in its own. 3 people were involved originally. Jack Leeson from Facilities, who he credited with being the father of the whole project, Gary Dysart, I might be saying that wrong, from Facilities, and John Roberts himself. So they started out in Plant 4 of Highland Park in an abandoned bathroom before the project got its own real digs in 1983. The first formal engineering team was made up of Bob Ziegenfelder and John Roberts and reported to the head of engineering, Bob Sinclair, who incidentally, Bob Sinclair had run the Valiant team, which was the first modern-day platform team or cross-functional team approach within Chrysler. The Valiant was a major runaway success. Across the entire world, the Valiant was successful. But after that, Bob Sinclair refused to ever go back and use it again until the CTC itself. Highland Park was Chrysler's world headquarters from before it was founded in 1925. It was where the first Chrysler was developed. So what they did was they set up their guidelines in what they called black books. Not the British TV show, but books of guidelines. And the first one was done in 1985. 22 different approaches had been examined now for the center's development. They then looked at 4 approaches for further refinement. So they originally planned to spend about $500 million on this move the engineering over, but leave the dyno cells where they tested engines, and leave the headquarters behind especially. And I can imagine that this would have been a very freeing experience for the engineers involved in the project. But Bob Sinclair at engineering, and some others within engineering, they really, really wanted all of engineering to move over, including state-of-the-art test facilities, and they also deserve credit for that, because that's exactly what happened there. And without those state-of-the-art test facilities, probably Chrysler's resurgence in the 1990s would not have happened, or it would have looked very different and not as good. That included pretty much everything that was there, that plan as of 1985, other than a full-scale acoustic wind tunnel. And that was a great thing to have. This was one way that they could catch up and surpass competitors. So the team working on the CTC grew to several hundred people, including engineering, manufacturing, purchasing, and finance, as you'd expect. Hundreds of people had to be a standalone team to work cross-functionally and get it done. And without that setup, it probably never would have happened, or at least it would not have looked as good as it did. In mid-1988, the board approved a $1.6 billion new budget for the program because it had expanded quite a bit, as you can see. And at that point, the development team moved to Auburn Hills. Now, keep in mind that in 1987, Chrysler had bought American Motors. And so they were already planning this headquarters when they bought AMC. But it really came in very handy after they had AMC, because that's when all the stuff about cross-functional teams actually developing cars came to pass. And that's when Francois Castaing came over and took over as head of engineering. And he was very, very much into innovation. He did not stand still and let the grass grow under his feet. We will all miss Francois Castaing, and his influence on what was then Chrysler, what is now FCA US or Stellantis, depending on how global you want your view to be. Now, Lee Iacocca retired in 1992, and by then the cross-functional teams were already at work, and they were doing their thing in the new CTC. And then they commissioned more things. They had the full-scale aeroacoustic wind tunnel completed in 1999, and this is after Daimler took over. But it was planned in the late 80s and early 90s. So it's pretty impressive, really, that the building was still being put together. Now, John Roberts wanted to give credit to the people that I've mentioned, as well as Chris Theodore, who optimized the use of the facilities as they went up. So Chris Theodore was one of the people on the team who emphasized that cars had to be built in a cross-functional approach, where you had people from different parts of engineering and people from manufacturing and people from electronics and all of that. You had to have everybody working together so that you get an integrated system, because a car is not a bunch of parts. It's a system of parts, and the better they work together, the better the car. And it's kind of funny, but, it's like the Airflow was one of the first cars where the front and rear suspension was designed to work in harmony. That hadn't really been thought of before. And then you end up in the 60s, you still have front suspension and rear suspension designed by different people. And that is what the CTC helped to do. They probably would have had a much harder time switching to the cross-functional team approach, platform team approach, if they had had to stay in the Highland Park engineering offices, where you might have to go to a different building or at least a different floor if you were, say, a mechanical engineer and you needed an electronic engineer or an electrical engineer. If you were working on the rear suspension and you wanted to talk to the guy who's designing the front suspension. And if you read the stories about the Valiant development, you find that there were a lot of areas where just being in the same room solved problems. And the same was true, you can find in my Viper book, stories about, well, I was working on this and the guy next to me heard me saying this and he said, well, I have a solution for you. So there's a lot of problems that get solved if people are in the same room or at least in the same general area. And Chris Theodore said, and I wish I still had the audio for this, that the only bad part of the facility was that the executives in Highland Park, who were at the old headquarters, they got very lonely down there and they got envious. And so Bob Eden, then the CEO, and the other leaders decided that they had to move to the Chrysler Technology Center. And that required building on the headquarters tower, which is the one with the great big pentastar built in that supposedly Daimler tried to have removed. Theodore also mentioned he thought that Lee Iacocca was kind of nuts to be wasting money like that at the time when the company was in rough times, but it turned out, quote, to be one of the greatest enablers to creating the team's cultural change. This mug, which I've had set aside, for the life of me, I can't recall who gave it to me. I wish I could. It was Chrysler's advantage. It helped them to become a state-of-the-art company. It helped them, and I realize that for some of you, especially the younger viewers, you think of Chrysler. It's very different now in 2024 than it was in the early and mid-90s and in the late 90s. Chrysler was at one point making what critics called the best cars in their class. They were doing it well. They were creating new spaces. They were getting new ideas out. They revitalized the large car, the large sedan segment, which was just about dead when they came out with the Intrepid, the New Yorker, the Concorde, the Eagle Vision. That group of cars revitalized the segment. You would not have believed the difference between something like the Plymouth Sundance, which they lost thousands of dollars on every one that they sold, $3,000 or $4,000 on each one, maybe even $5,000. And this was a car that you could buy for $8,000. And then they replaced that with the Neon, which was the best in its class in performance by far, and cost a little bit more, but they made a profit of thousands of dollars, even with the warranty problems that they had with that car due to Bob Eden reportedly, allegedly, cheaping out on the design. Even with those warranty costs taken into account, the Neon made money as a small car. That was revolutionary for an American maker at the time. So Chrysler used to be a serious automaker that people really respected and took seriously not that long ago. And yes, that did all end when they merged with Daimler. Part of it was damage to their reputation from all of the journalists saying, oh, that's good, we'll mix up Chrysler's styling, which wasn't their main point, although they were good at it, with Daimler's engineering and quality. And at the time, Chrysler was trouncing Daimler in long-term durability and quality studies. So it's a sad story what happened to Chrysler, but parts of Chrysler's history are really, what's the word, inspiring, and it can tell you what to do. And in this case, you had this company that looked like it was dying in the late 80s, and they put their money and their time and their effort into this new facility, and it did give them a new lease on life, along with the new processes that it helped along. And Chrysler was reborn until 1998. So I'm Dave from Motels. I hope that you'll come back for more.